Move away from her.
Put her down right now!
The words weren't loud.
She doesn't belong to you!
They didn't need to be. Marcus had been shouting for a full minute already, and now the ballroom held its breath waiting for what came next. He'd crossed the dance floor in 3 furious strides, grabbing Elizabeth's wrist hard enough to leave marks, dragging her toward the exit while 200 wedding guests pretended not to watch a scene that had stopped being private the moment he raised his voice. She'd twisted away from him, stumbled backward into the cake table, and gone down before anyone could catch her. Marcus stood over her, chest heaving, still shouting something about ownership, about how she belonged to him and always would. Then a man none of them recognized stepped out of the shadows near the champagne fountain, and the entire room seemed to lose its air at once. Welcome. If you're new here, make sure you like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked, unhurried, past the frozen string quartet and the caterers still holding their trays, and knelt beside her on the marble floor like the chaos around him didn't exist. He slid one arm beneath her shoulders, the other beneath her knees, and lifted her against his chest as easily as lifting a memory. Marcus's face twisted. Who the hell do you think you are? The man didn't answer right away. He looked down at Elizabeth first, at the faint tremor still running through her, and something unreadable passed behind his eyes before it vanished again. Only then did he lift his gaze to Marcus. Move away from her, he said again, quieter this time, and somehow that was worse. Marcus laughed, but it came out thin. You don't know who you're dealing with. Her family answers to me. Marcus Hale. The stranger's voice carried without effort, cutting clean through the murmuring crowd. Vice President of Hale Logistics. 6 months behind on payroll. Your company's last operating loan, $42 million, came through Halcyon Trust. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it ached. Halcyon Trust is mine. The color drained out of Marcus's face in one long slide. Which means, the man continued, tightening his hold on Elizabeth without looking away, your warehouses, your shipping contracts, your name on every door in that building, all of it exists because I haven't decided to end it yet. Touch her again, and I will. No one in the ballroom moved. Phones had already come up, dozens of them, small glowing rectangles capturing a moment none of them understood, but all of them would repeat by morning. Marcus opened his mouth, found nothing to say, and closed it again. Who are you? He finally managed, and it wasn't a demand anymore. It was closer to fear. Seo Jun, the man said simply, as if the name alone should have been warning enough. He turned then, Elizabeth cradled against his chest, her dark curls falling loose over his forearm, and walked toward the tall glass doors at the far end of the ballroom. Behind him, 200 guests stood frozen in their seats, wine glasses forgotten, cake still scattered across the floor in ruined white shards, and not a single one of them moved to stop him. Not a single one of them dared. The doors closed behind him with a soft, final click, and somewhere beyond them, a black car was already waiting. Seo Jun carried her through the glass doors and into the cool night air before he allowed himself to feel the weight of what had just happened. Elizabeth stirred faintly against his chest, her breathing shallow, her pulse fluttering beneath the thin skin of her wrist. Behind him, the ballroom noise swelled into chaos, gasps and phone flashes and someone finally screaming for a doctor, but none of it reached him the way it should have. He had learned long ago how to let noise become distance. A black convoy waited at the curb, engines already running, 3 men in dark suits stepping out the moment the doors opened. None of them asked questions. They simply moved, opening the rear door of the center vehicle, one sliding into position at the front gate of the hotel to block the path behind him. Sir. One of the men, Ty Minute, fell into step beside him, eyes scanning the crowd gathering at the entrance. Hale is coming out. Seo Jun didn't slow his pace. Let him. Marcus burst through the doors seconds later, tie loosened, face blotched red with humiliation and rage. He shouted something, a threat, a demand. The words tangled together into noise that meant nothing anymore. Seo Jun paused at the open car door, adjusting his hold on Elizabeth so her head rested more securely against his shoulder, and only then did he look back. You have until Monday, he said, voice even, almost bored. Pay down the loan in full, or I begin liquidating everything with your name on it. Starting with the warehouses in Incheon. Marcus's mouth opened, closed. The fury in his eyes flickered, just for a moment, into something closer to panic. This isn't over, Marcus managed. Seo-jun studied him the way a man might study a stain he intended to remove later. It already is. He ducked into the car, settling Elizabeth carefully across the leather seat, her head resting against his arm rather than the cold window. The door shut with a soft, expensive click, sealing away Marcus's shouting, the flashing phones, the entire wreckage of a night that had never belonged to Seo-jun in the first place, and yet here he was, holding the only piece of it that mattered. The convoy pulled away from the curb in smooth, practiced formation, 3 vehicles moving through the city like a single organism. Seo-jun looked down at Elizabeth's face, still pale, a faint crease of tension between her brows even in unconsciousness. He reached over, without quite deciding to, and brushed a loose curl away from her cheek. "Where are we taking her?" Taiminute asked from the front seat, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. "The Han estate," Seo-jun said. "Full security detail, effective immediately. No one enters the grounds without my authorization. Not press, not police, not her mother." Taiminute hesitated. "And Hale?" "Freeze every account linked to Halcyon Trust's exposure. I want his liquidity gone by sunrise." Seo-jun's voice stayed level, almost gentle, which was somehow more unsettling than if he had shouted. He humiliated her in front of 200 people. "I intend to be thorough." The car merged onto the private overpass that avoided the city center entirely, streetlights sliding gold and silver across the tinted windows. Elizabeth's fingers twitched against her own lap, some small motion toward consciousness, and Seo-jun watched it happen the way he might watch a fault line shift, aware that everything on the other side of it would be different. He didn't know her. Not really. He had seen her twice before tonight, once across a crowded fundraiser and once in a photograph Taiminute had flagged during a routine background sweep on Marcus Hale. He hadn't expected to feel anything looking at her name in a file. He hadn't expected to feel anything at all, not anymore, not in the 4 years since the doctors had first mentioned words like progression and timeline in tones meant to be gentle. And yet here he was, driving through the dark with a stranger's head resting against his chest, some old and unfamiliar instinct rising in him that felt dangerously close to wanting to protect something. The car slowed as the estate gates came into view, tall iron and stone disappearing into manicured dark. Seo-jun looked down at her one last time before the vehicle came to a stop. "You're safe now," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Whether you asked for it or not." The gates opened. The convoy rolled through. Before I go on, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Trust me. Elizabeth woke to unfamiliar silk sheets and the soft grey light of an unfamiliar ceiling, and for a long moment she simply lay there, trying to piece together how she had gone from the Grand Larkspur ballroom to a bed that smelled faintly of cedar and rain. Her wrist ached where Marcus's fingers had dug in. Her head throbbed with the memory of the marble floor rushing up to meet her. Everything after that was fragments, a voice she didn't recognize, arms that didn't shake even when they should have. A woman in a pale grey uniform knocked once before entering, carrying a tray of tea and a folded silk robe. "Miss Elizabeth. You're awake. Mr. Han asked to be informed the moment you were." "Mr. Han," Elizabeth repeated, testing the name. It meant nothing to her and everything at once. "He's in the East Wing," the woman said gently. "He'll come when you're ready. Please, rest a little longer first." Elizabeth didn't rest. She sat up, pressed her palm to her temple, and tried to remember every detail of the man who had lifted her off that floor like she weighed nothing at all. In the East Wing, Seo-jun sat across from Dr. Kwon Yuna in a room lined with darkwood shelving and a single window overlooking the estate's private garden. She had flown in from Seoul General on 2 hours' notice, the same as she always did, because Seo-jun paid enough to guarantee that kind of urgency and asked for it rarely enough that she knew never to question the summons. "The latest scans," she said, sliding a folder across the table, "show continued progression in the left ventricular wall. Faster than the last quarter." Seo-jun didn't open the folder. He already knew what it would say before she said it, the way he had known for the better part of 2 years now. "Give me numbers, not descriptions." Dr. Kwon exhaled slowly. 8 months. Perhaps 10 if you rest more than you currently do, which we both know you won't. He absorbed the number the way he absorbed everything now, without visible reaction, filing it into the same quiet place where he kept every other inevitability. "Continue the current medication. Nothing changes." "Something should change," she said, sharper now, the professional distance cracking. You cannot keep running an empire the size of yours on borrowed time and refuse every treatment that might buy you more of it. The treatments buy discomfort, Seo-jun said. Not time. We've had this conversation. She studied him for a long moment, something almost sad crossing her face. There's a woman in the West Wing. Security mentioned you carried her out of a ballroom yourself. Seo-jun's jaw tightened, just slightly. She's a matter of protection. Nothing more. Is that why you're smiling right now? Dr. Kwon asked quietly. Even a little. He hadn't realized he was. He said nothing, and after a moment she gathered her folder, understanding that the conversation had reached its limit, and left him alone with the number she had given him and the silence that followed it. He found Elizabeth an hour later in the garden, wrapped in the robe the staff had given her, standing at the edge of the koi pond like she wasn't entirely sure the ground beneath her was real. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and for a moment neither of them spoke. You're the one from the ballroom, she said finally. I am. You told Marcus you owned his loans. Her voice wavered, not from fear, but from the effort of trying to make sense of a night that refused to make sense. Is that true? Every word of it. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring at him like she was trying to find the seam where the danger in him met the calm. Why would you do any of that for someone you don't know? Seo-jun looked past her, toward the koi moving slow and silent beneath the water, and thought of the number Dr. Kwon had given him less than an hour ago. 8 months. Perhaps 10. Because someone should have stopped him a long time before tonight, he said. And no one else was going to. It wasn't the whole truth. It wasn't even close. But it was the only piece of it he was willing to hand her yet. Hold on. Subscribe real quick and drop your country. This just took a dark turn. 3 days after the wedding that never happened, Marcus Hale sat in his office watching his own company collapse in real time, and understood, far too late, exactly what kind of enemy he had made. The first account froze on Monday morning, precisely as promised. Halcyon Trust's automated systems flagged the Hale Logistics operating line for immediate review, citing irregularities that hadn't existed the week before and now, somehow, could not be disputed. By Tuesday, 2 of his shipping partners had quietly withdrawn from contracts they'd held for 6 years, citing vague concerns about liquidity that no one had raised until a single phone call changed everything. By Wednesday, his own board was requesting an emergency meeting. They're not just cutting the loan, his chief financial officer said, sliding a report across the conference table with hands that visibly shook. They're unwinding every position connected to us. Insurance underwriters, port authorities, 3 of our biggest retail clients. It's like someone drew a map of every artery keeping this company alive and started cutting them one at a time. Someone did, Marcus said quietly, staring at the numbers without really seeing them. Across the city, in a glass tower that bore no name on its exterior, Seo-jun reviewed the same reports with far less urgency and considerably more satisfaction. Time Minute stood at the far end of the table, relaying updates with the clipped efficiency of a man who had learned long ago not to ask why his employer wanted certain things destroyed. Incheon warehouses default in 4 days, Time Minute said. The retail contracts are already gone. His board is talking about removing him before the quarter ends. Good. Seo-jun didn't look up from the folder in front of him, a separate one entirely, filled with security schedules and estate blueprints. What about personal assets? Property, accounts, anything outside the company structure? Frozen where we have reach. He still owns the penthouse outright, and there's an offshore account we haven't been able to touch yet. Find a way to touch it. Time Minute hesitated, the way he always did when a request pushed slightly past the line of what was strictly necessary. Sir, if I may. The company alone would have ended him financially. This is beyond that now. Seo-jun finally looked up, and something in his expression made Time Minute regret the question immediately. He grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise it in front of 200 people, and would have done considerably worse the moment he got her alone. I am not interested in ending him financially. I am interested in ending every version of power he has ever had access to. Time Minute said nothing further. He simply nodded and left to make the calls. Later that evening, Elizabeth found Seo-jun in the same study where she'd first learned his name, standing at the window with a tablet in hand, his expression unreadable in the low light. She had spent the last 3 days moving through the estate like a guest uncertain of her welcome, though every member of the staff treated her instructions as though they came from Seo-jun himself. "I heard about Marcus's company," she said carefully, stepping into the room. "The layoffs. The board meeting." "You heard correctly. Is that your doing?" He set the tablet down and turned to face her fully, and for the first time since the ballroom, she saw something almost like hesitation cross his features. "It is." She wrapped her arms around herself, searching his face for something she couldn't name. Fear should have been the obvious response. She knew that. Some rational corner of her mind insisted on it. Watching a man dismantle another man's entire empire in 3 days with the same ease most people order dinner. Instead, what rose in her chest was something quieter, warmer, dangerously close to relief. "Thank you," she said finally, "for making sure I never have to see him again." "You won't," Seo-jun said, and for once his voice carried none of its usual distance. "Not while I'm still breathing." He didn't tell her what that phrase cost him to say, or how much shorter that promise might prove than either of them wanted to believe. Real quick, hit subscribe and drop your location. The next moment is critical. Elizabeth found him in the estate's private gym 3 mornings later, shirt discarded over a bench, sweat glistening against the dense black ink covering his shoulders and spreading down both arms. She had come looking for tea, or maybe just company, and instead found herself standing frozen in the doorway, unable to look away from the artwork stretched across his skin, dragons coiled around his forearms, chrysanthemums blooming across his ribs, an entire mythology inked into a man who otherwise gave away nothing about himself at all. "You're staring," Seo-jun said, without turning around. "I'm sorry." She didn't move. "I've just never seen anything like it." He set down the weight in his hand and reached for a towel, and when he finally turned to face her, there was something almost amused in his expression, a rare softening around otherwise guarded eyes. Most people look away. Or ask if it hurt. Did it? Every session. He draped the towel around his neck. Some things are worth the pain if the result outlasts you. She stepped further into the room, curiosity overtaking the caution she'd carried since the ballroom. How long did all of this take? 6 years. Different artists, different cities. Seoul, Tokyo, one very difficult month in Kyoto. He glanced down at his own arm as though seeing it fresh. Most men in my position wear armor made of other things. Suits. Bodyguards. I decided mine should be something I couldn't take off, even if I wanted to. Why would you want to? Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. There are mornings the weight of it feels heavier than it should. She wanted to ask what that meant, wanted to press further into the crack she'd just glimpsed in his composure, but he'd already turned away, reaching for his shirt, the moment closing as quickly as it had opened. Still, she found herself cataloguing it, filing it alongside the other small fractures she'd started noticing since the wedding. The way his jaw tightened whenever his phone buzzed with a number she never saw. The way he sometimes pressed his palm flat against his own chest when he thought no one was watching, as though checking that something was still there. "Thank you," she said suddenly, "for what you did to Marcus's company." He paused, shirt half buttoned. "You already thanked me for that." "I know. I wanted to say it again, now that I understand what it actually cost you to make that kind of enemy." She met his eyes, steadier than she expected to be. "You didn't have to do any of this. The estate, the security, ruining a man who deserved it. You could have just walked away after that night and let your people handle the rest from a distance." "I could have," he agreed. "Then why didn't you?" For a long moment he said nothing, studying her the way he might study a problem he hadn't yet decided how to solve. "Because carrying you out of that ballroom was the first thing in longer than I care to admit that felt like it mattered more than a transaction." The words landed heavier than either of them expected, and Elizabeth watched something shift across his face immediately after, a flicker of alarm at his own honesty, quickly smoothed back into practiced calm. "I should get back to work," he said, already reaching for the folder waiting on the bench. "Seo-jun." She said his name for the first time, and he stilled at the sound of it. "You don't have to hide behind the ink and the suits with me. Not after everything you've already shown me." He looked at her then, really looked, something raw and unguarded passing behind his eyes before he caught it and pulled it back into darkness. "You have no idea what you're asking to see." "Then show me anyway," she said quietly. "I'm not afraid of you." "You should be," he murmured, but he didn't move away when she stepped closer, and for the first time since the night he'd lifted her off a ballroom floor, neither of them looked away. If this shocked you, repost it and hit subscribe. More is coming. Seo-jun took her to the coastal house 2 hours outside the city that evening, a modest structure by his standards, wood and glass overlooking a stretch of dark water, the first place Elizabeth had seen him choose for himself rather than for security or optics. No guards stood visible at the entrance. No staff moved through the halls. For the first time since the wedding, it was only the two of them, and the silence between them felt less like distance and more like an invitation. "You built this?" she asked, standing at the wide windows facing the sea. "Bought it. Barely touched it since." He moved to the kitchen, sleeves rolled, pouring wine into 2 glasses with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. "I come here when the noise gets too loud. Which, lately, is more often than I'd like to admit." "What noise?" He handed her a glass, close enough now that she could see the faint shadows beneath his eyes, exhaustion he usually kept hidden behind expensive tailoring. "Everything I carry in the city. The company, the enemies, the people who need something from me every hour of every day." He looked at her for a long moment. "Tonight, I wanted to bring something here that didn't." They ate dinner on the terrace as the sky darkened over the water, conversation drifting easily between them in a way neither expected, laughter surfacing in places Elizabeth hadn't thought possible with a man who wore silence like armor. She learned he had been raised by an uncle who ran half the city's underground trade before Seo-jun inherited and expanded it into something far more entrenched. He learned she had almost married a man who saw her as a symbol rather than a person, and that some night she still wondered what was wrong with her that she hadn't seen it sooner. "Nothing was wrong with you," Seo-jun said, voice low. He simply wasn't capable of seeing what he had. "And you are?" she asked, testing the question, unsure if she wanted the answer. He set down his glass, and for once didn't retreat behind distance or deflection. "I have spent 6 years building walls so high that even I forgot what was on the other side of them. And in 1 week, you've made me remember." The wind moved off the water, carrying salt and quiet, and Elizabeth found herself closing the space between their chairs without deciding to. "Why me?" "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty of it seemed to cost him something. "I have met beautiful women, powerful women, women far better suited to the life I lead. None of them made me want to put any of it down. You looked at my tattoos in that gym and asked if they hurt instead of asking what they cost. You looked at what I did to Marcus and thanked me instead of fearing me." He reached out, brushing his knuckles gently along her jaw. "You looked at me, Elizabeth. Not the Empire. Not the danger. Me." She turned her face into his palm, and something in his expression cracked entirely open, years of careful control giving way all at once. "I'm terrified of what happens if I let you in," he said quietly, "and even more terrified of what happens if I don't." "Then stop being terrified," she whispered, "and let me decide if I can handle it." He kissed her then, slow and searching, years of restraint dissolving into something neither of them tried to stop. The wind carried the sound of the tide against the rocks below, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Seo-jun let himself exist entirely in a single moment without calculating what came after it. Her hands found the collar of his shirt, his hands found the curve of her waist, and the walls he had spent 6 years building came down not with force, but with something far more dangerous, willingness. Later, wrapped in the quiet dark of the house with her head resting against his chest exactly the way it had the night he carried her out of that ballroom, Elizabeth felt him press his palm briefly over his own heart, the same gesture she'd noticed before, and this time she covered his hand with hers. "What are you checking for?" she asked softly. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she almost thought he wouldn't answer. "Time," he finally said. "I'm checking for time." She didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. But she felt the weight of it settle over them both, quiet and unspoken, long after the words had faded into the dark. "Before the reveal, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. You'll thank me." Seo-jun collapsed 11 days after the wedding, in the middle of a briefing with 3 of his senior lieutenants, the room going sideways beneath him before he even registered the pain spreading through his chest. Time in it caught him before he hit the floor, shouting orders that blurred together into noise, and the last clear thought Seo-jun had before the world went dark was Elizabeth's face, and how badly he had wanted more time to explain everything he hadn't told her yet. She arrived at Seoul General 40 minutes later, still in the clothes she'd been wearing when Tae-min's call came through, breathless and pale and demanding answers no one seemed willing to give her. A nurse finally led her to a private waiting room reserved for family, and it was there, an hour later, that Dr. Kwon Yuna found her. "You're the woman staying at the estate," Dr. Kwon said carefully, closing the door behind her. "Please, just tell me what's happening." Elizabeth's voice cracked. "No one will tell me anything." Dr. Kwon studied her for a long moment, weighing loyalty against the plain fact that Seo-jun had never once let anyone close enough to need this conversation before. "He has a condition. Restrictive cardiomyopathy, advanced stage. We've been managing it for 2 years." She hesitated. Managing isn't the same as treating. There is no treatment left that changes the outcome. Only the timeline. Elizabeth felt the floor tilt beneath her, the same way it had the night of the wedding, except this time no one was there to catch her before the words landed fully. "What timeline?" "Months," Dr. Kwon said quietly. "Possibly less, after tonight." He never said anything. Her voice broke entirely now, tears she couldn't stop. "He let me fall in love with him and never once said anything." "He didn't tell anyone," Dr. Kwon said. "Not his closest advisor. Not the men who would die for him without question. You're the first person he's allowed near enough to almost find out on his own." She reached out, resting a hand briefly on Elizabeth's shoulder. "That should tell you something about what you mean to him, even if he never said the words." They let her into his room an hour later, monitors humming softly around a bed that seemed far too large for the still, quiet man lying in it. Seo-jun's eyes opened slowly when she stepped inside, and something like shame crossed his face the moment he saw her tears. "You know," he said, voice rough. "Kwon told you." "You should have told me." She crossed the room and gripped his hand, refusing to let the trembling in her fingers stop her. "Months, Seo-jun. You were going to let me fall for a man who was dying and never say a single word." "I didn't want you to look at me the way you're looking at me right now," he said. "Like something already lost." "I'm not looking at you like you're lost." She pressed his hand against her chest, over her own racing heart, forcing him to feel how unwilling it was to let him go. "I'm looking at you like a man I intend to fight for, whether you like it or not." "Elizabeth." Her name came out broken, the first time she'd heard him sound anything less than composed. "I have months. Maybe less now. You deserve a lifetime with someone who can promise you one." "I don't want a lifetime with someone else," she said fiercely, tears falling freely now. "I want whatever time you have left, all of it, every single day you're willing to give me. And I am not leaving this room or your side until you understand that." He looked at her for a long, silent moment, something breaking open behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the machines monitoring his failing heart. "I spent 6 years building walls so no one could ever ask me for more than I could give," he said finally. "You've never asked me for anything I couldn't." She leaned down and pressed her forehead against his, both of them shaking, both of them refusing to look away from what they now understood was coming. "Then let me stay," she whispered. "However much time we have." "Stay," he said, the word barely a breath. "Please, stay." Outside the window, the city lights burned on, indifferent to the quiet devastation unfolding in a single hospital room, while inside it, 2 people held on to each other and refused, for as long as they possibly could, to let the ending arrive any sooner than it had to. Before I go on, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Trust me. They married 3 weeks later, in the garden behind the coastal house. Beneath a canopy of white orchids Elizabeth had chosen herself and String Light's time in it had spent 2 sleepless nights installing along the tree line. There were no 200 guests this time, no towering cake, no microphones waiting to broadcast cruelty to a watching crowd. There was only a small circle of people who had earned their place there, Dr. Kwon standing quietly near the back, Time in it in a suit instead of his usual dark security uniform, and the sound of the tide moving steady against the rocks below. Seo-jun stood at the end of the aisle in a pale grey suit, sleeves for once buttoned all the way to his wrists, though nothing could hide the exhaustion that had settled permanently beneath his eyes over the past weeks. He had grown thinner. He moved more carefully now, pausing sometimes mid-sentence to steady his breathing before continuing, small betrayals of a body running out of road. None of it mattered the moment Elizabeth appeared at the far end of the garden in a simple ivory dress, her hair loose the way he'd told her once he preferred it, and the entire ceremony narrowed down to the space between them. "You didn't have to do all this," she said quietly as she reached him, glancing at the orchids, the lights, the quiet effort visible in every detail. "I wanted you to have a wedding that wasn't ruined by someone else's cruelty," he said. "Even if it's smaller than what you deserved." "It's exactly what I wanted," she whispered. "Every piece of it." The officiant, an old friend of Dr. Kwon's who asked no questions about the urgency of the request, spoke the ceremony in low, unhurried tones, and when it came time for vows, Seo-jun reached for both her hands, his grip weaker than it had been even a week earlier, though his voice stayed steady through sheer will. "I spent most of my life believing certain things weren't meant for men like me," he said. "Love. Softness. A future worth imagining instead of simply managing. You didn't ask me to become someone else to deserve those things. You simply refused to leave until I believed I already did." He pressed his forehead briefly to hers. "However much time I have left, Elizabeth, I intend to spend every day of it making sure you never once doubt that you were the best thing that happened to me." Elizabeth's vows came through tears she didn't try to hide. "I used to think love was something you had to earn by being perfect enough, quiet enough, easy enough to keep." Her voice wavered, steadied. "You taught me it's something you choose over and over, especially when it's hard, especially when it hurts. I choose you, Seo-jun. However many days we have left, I choose all of them." When the officiant pronounced them married, the small gathering didn't erupt into applause the way a larger crowd might have. Instead, there was only quiet, warm, and complete, Dr. Kwon wiping her eyes without shame, Time in it looking away to hide his own, the ocean continuing its steady rhythm beyond the garden wall as if marking time for all of them. That night, they sat together on the terrace overlooking the water, Elizabeth wrapped in Seo-jun's jacket against the evening chill, his arm around her though it visibly cost him effort to keep it there. Neither spoke for a long while, content simply to exist together in the dark. "Regrets?" he asked finally, voice barely above the sound of the tide. "Only that I didn't find you sooner," she said, resting her head against his shoulder. "You." He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the water like he was memorizing it. "None," he said softly. "Not one single regret, Elizabeth. Not for any of it." She held his hand tighter, feeling the tremor beneath his fingers that he could no longer fully hide, and refused, the same way she had in that hospital room, to let herself think about how few nights like this one remained. "Hold on, subscribe real quick and drop your country. This just took a dark turn." The final weeks moved slower than either of them expected. Quiet mornings stretched into quiet afternoons, the coastal house holding them both in a kind of gentle suspension neither wanted to disturb by naming what was coming. Seo-jun grew weaker by degrees, though he refused a wheelchair until his leg simply wouldn't allow otherwise, and refused morphine until the pain made refusing impossible. Elizabeth stayed beside him through all of it, learning the rhythm of his labored breathing the way she'd once learned the rhythm of his silences. Dr. Kwon visited every 3 days now instead of every 3 weeks, though there was little left for her to do beyond monitoring what both of them already understood couldn't be stopped. On her last visit, she sat with Elizabeth on the terrace while Seo-jun slept inside, the autumn light turning the water gold beyond the rocks. "How long?" Elizabeth asked, no longer flinching from the question. "Days," Dr. Kwon said gently. "Perhaps a week, if is fortunate." Elizabeth nodded, tears falling silently, no longer with the shock of the hospital room weeks earlier, but with the quieter grief of someone who had already made peace with an ending she couldn't prevent. "Thank you for not lying to me." "He asked me never to," Dr. Kwon said. "From the very first conversation. He said you deserved better than the comfort of a lie." That evening, Seo-jun woke to find Elizabeth beside him, her hand wrapped around his, and for a moment his eyes carried none of the exhaustion that had settled into every other part of him. "You're still here," he murmured. "Where else would I be?" He managed a faint smile, the ghost of the composed, dangerous man she'd first seen carrying her out of a ballroom months earlier, though softened now into something entirely different. "I used to think dying alone was simply the price of the life I chose. Too much blood on my hands to expect anything gentler at the end of it." His grip tightened weakly around her fingers. "I didn't expect you." "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. "Not tonight. Not ever, as long as you're here." He was quiet for a long moment, gathering strength for words that clearly cost him. "I need you to promise me something." "Anything." "When this is over," he said, each word slower than the last, "you keep living. Not carefully. Not small, the way you lived before I met you. Bravely. Loudly. Take up exactly as much space in the world as you deserve to, and don't you dare shrink yourself for anyone ever again. His eyes held hers, fierce despite the weakness. Promise me that. I promise, she said, voice breaking. Good. He exhaled, something in his shoulders finally loosening, as if that single promise had settled the last piece of unfinished business he'd been carrying. Then I'm not afraid anymore. The room grew quiet around them, the sound of the tide drifting faintly through the open window, and Elizabeth held his hand through the long hours that followed, watching the rise and fall of his chest grow slower, gentler, until sometime near dawn it simply didn't rise again. There was no dramatic final breath, no last desperate words, only a quiet stillness settling over the man who had carried her out of chaos months earlier and never once let her go since. She stayed beside him long after the monitors fell silent, her forehead pressed to his hand, the sunrise beginning to gild the water beyond the terrace in soft, indifferent gold, marking the start of a day he would never see and the beginning of a promise she intended to keep for the rest of her life. If this shocked you, repost it and hit subscribe. More is coming.